Let us be off. And the hunters, having gathered up the product of their expedition, rapidly made their way back along the path that they had marked by breaking boughs and bushes when they came. The density of the underbrush prevented their seeing the balloon, although they could not be far from it. A second shot was heard. "We must hurry," said Joe. "There, a third report. Why, it sounds to me as if he was defending himself against something. Let us make haste." They now began to run at the top of their speed. When they reached the outskirts of the forest, they, at first glance, saw the balloon in its place and the doctor in the car. "What's the matter?" shouted Kennedy. "Good God!" suddenly exclaimed Joe. "What do you see?" "Down there, look, a crowd of blacks surrounding the balloon." And in fact there, 2 miles from where they were, they saw some 30 wild natives close together, yelling, gesticulating, and cutting all kinds of antics at the foot of the sycamore. Some, climbing into the tree itself, were making their way to the topmost branches. The danger seemed pressing. "My master is lost," cried Joe. "Come, a little more coolness, Joe, and let us see how we stand. We hold the lives of 4 of those villains in our hands. Forward, then." They had made a mile with headlong speed, when another report was heard from the car. The shot had evidently told upon a huge black demon who had been hoisting himself up by the anchor rope. A lifeless body fell from bough to bough and hung about 20 feet from the ground, its arms and legs swaying to and fro in the air. "Ha," said Joe, halting, "what does that fellow hold by?" "No matter what," said Kennedy. "Let us run, let us run." "Ah, Mr. Kennedy," said Joe again in a roar of laughter, by his tail, it's an ape, they're all apes." "Well, they're worse than men," said Kennedy as he dashed into the midst of the howling crowd. It was indeed a troop of very formidable baboons of the dog-faced species. These creatures are brutal, ferocious, and horrible to look upon, with their dog-like muzzles and savage expression. However, a few shots scattered them, and the chattering horde scampered off, leaving several of their number on the ground. In a moment Kennedy was on the ladder, and Joe, clambering up the branches, detached the anchor. The car then dipped to where he was, and he got into it without difficulty. A few minutes later, the Victoria slowly ascended and soared away to the eastward, wafted by a moderate wind. "That was an attack for you," said Joe. "We thought you were surrounded by natives." "Well, fortunately they were only apes," said the doctor. "At a distance there's no great difference," remarked Kennedy. "Nor close at hand either," added Joe. "Well, however that may be," resumed Ferguson, "this attack of apes might have had the most serious consequences. Had the anchor yielded to their repeated efforts, who knows whither the wind would have carried me." "What did I tell you, Mr. Kennedy?" "You were right, Joe, but even right as you may have been, you were at that moment preparing some antelope steaks, the very sight of which gave me a monstrous appetite." "I believe you," said the doctor. "The flesh of the antelope is exquisite." "You may judge of that yourself now, sir, for supper's ready." "Upon my word as a sportsman, those venison steaks have a gamey flavour that's not to be sneezed at, I tell you." "Good," said Joe with his mouth full. "I could live on antelope all the days of my life, and all the better with a glass of grog to wash it down." So saying, the good fellow went to work to prepare a jorum of that fragrant beverage, and all hands tasted it with satisfaction. "Everything has gone well thus far," said he. "Very well indeed," assented Kennedy. "Come now, Mr. Kennedy, are you sorry that you came with us?" "I'd like to see anybody prevent my coming." It was now 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The Victoria had struck a more rapid current. The face of the country was gradually rising, and ere long, the barometer indicated a height of 1,500 feet above the level of the sea. The doctor was, therefore, obliged to keep his balloon up by a quite considerable dilation of gas, and the cylinder was hard at work all the time. Towards 7 o'clock, the balloon was sailing over the basin of Canyeam. The doctor immediately recognized that immense clearing, 10 miles in extent, with its villages buried in the midst of baobab and calabash trees. It is the residence of one of the sultans of the Ugogo country, where civilization is perhaps the least backward. The natives there are less addicted to selling members of their own families, but still, men and animals all live together in round huts without frames that look like haystacks. Beyond Canyeam the soil becomes arid and stony, but in an hour's journey in a fertile dip of the soil, vegetation had resumed all its vigor at some distance from Mdaburu. The wind fell with the close of the day, and the atmosphere seemed to sleep. The doctor vainly sought for a current of air at different heights, and at last, seeing this calm of all nature, he resolved to pass the night afloat, and for greater safety rose to the height of 1,000 feet, where the balloon remained motionless. The night was magnificent, the heavens glittering with stars and profoundly silent in the upper air. Dick and Joe stretched themselves on their peaceful couch and were soon sound asleep, the doctor keeping the first watch. At 12 o'clock the latter was relieved by Kennedy. "Should the slightest accident happen, waken me," said Ferguson, "and above all things don't lose sight of the barometer. To us it is the compass." The night was cold. There were 27 degrees of difference between its temperature and that of the daytime. With nightfall had begun the nocturnal concert of animals driven from their hiding places by hunger and thirst. The frogs struck in their guttural soprano, redoubled by the yelping of the jackals, while the imposing bass of the African lion sustained the accords of this living orchestra. Upon resuming his post in the morning, the doctor consulted his compass and found that the wind had changed during the night. The balloon had been bearing about 30 miles to the northwest during the last 2 hours. It was then passing over Mabanguru, a stony country, strewn with blocks of syenite of a fine polish, and knobbed with huge boulders and angular ridges of rock. Conic masses like the rocks of Karnak studded the soil like so many druidic dolmens. The bones of buffaloes and elephants whitened it here and there, but few trees could be seen, excepting in the east where there were dense woods, among which a few villages lay half concealed. Towards 7 o'clock they saw a huge round rock nearly 2 miles in extent, like an immense tortoise. "We are on the right track," said Dr. Ferguson. "There's Jihaule Mkoa where we must halt for a few minutes. I am going to renew the supply of water necessary for my cylinder, and so let us try to anchor somewhere." "There are very few trees," replied the hunter. "Never mind, let us try. Joe, throw out the anchors." The balloon, gradually losing its ascensional force, approached the ground. The anchors ran along until, at last, one of them caught in the fissure of a rock, and the balloon remained motionless. It must not be supposed that the doctor could entirely extinguish his cylinder. During these halts, the equilibrium of the balloon had been calculated at the level of the sea, and as the country was continually ascending, and had reached an elevation of from 600 to 700 feet, the balloon would have had a tendency to go lower than the surface of the soil itself. It was therefore necessary to sustain it by a certain dilation of the gas. But, in case the doctor, in the absence of all wind, had let the car rest upon the ground, the balloon, thus relieved of a considerable weight, would have kept up of itself without the aid of the cylinder. The maps indicated extensive ponds on the western slope of the Jihaule Mkoa. Joe went thither alone with a cask that would hold about 10 gallons. He found the place pointed out to him, without difficulty, near to a deserted village, got his stock of water, and returned in less than 3/4 of an hour. He had seen nothing particular excepting some immense elephant pits. In fact, he came very near falling into one of them, at the bottom of which lay a half-eaten carcass. He brought back with him a sort of clover which the apes eat with avidity. The doctor recognized the fruit of the mbenbu, tree which grows in profusion, on the western part of Jihaule Mkoa. Ferguson waited for Joe with a certain feeling of impatience, for even a short halt in this inhospitable region always inspires a degree of fear. The water was got aboard without trouble, as the car was nearly resting on the ground. Joe then found it easy to loosen the anchor and leaped lightly to his place beside the doctor. The latter then replenished the flame in the cylinder, and the balloon majestically soared into the air. It was then about 100 miles from Kazay, an important establishment in the interior of Africa, where, thanks to a south-southeasterly current, the travellers might hope to arrive on that same day. They were moving at the rate of 14 miles per hour, and the guidance of the balloon was becoming difficult, as they dared not rise very high without extreme dilation of the gas, the country itself being at an average height of 3,000 feet. Hence the doctor preferred not to force the dilation, and so adroitly followed the sinuosities of a pretty sharply inclined plane, and swept very close to the villages of Thembo and Turawells. The latter forms part of the Unyamwezi, a magnificent country where the trees attain enormous dimensions, among them the cactus, which grows to gigantic size. About 2 o'clock, in magnificent weather, but under a fiery sun that devoured the least breath of air, the balloon was floating over the town of Kazay. situated about 350 miles from the coast. We left Zanzibar at 9 o'clock in the morning, said the doctor, consulting his notes, and after 2 days' passage we have, including our deviations, travelled nearly 500 geographical miles. Captains Burton and Speke took 4 months and a half to make the same distance. Chapter 15th. Keze, the noisy marketplace, the appearance of the balloon, the Wangaga, the sons of the moon, the doctor's walk, the population of the place, the royal tembe, the sultan's wives, a royal drunken bout, Joe an object of worship, how they dance in the moon, a reaction, 2 moons in one sky, the instability of divine honors. Keze, an important point in Central Africa, is not a city. In truth, there are no cities in the interior. Keze is but a collection of 6 extensive excavations. There are enclosed a few houses and slave huts, with little courtyards and small gardens, carefully cultivated with onions, potatoes, cucumbers, pumpkins, and mushrooms, of perfect flavor, growing most luxuriantly. The Unyamwezi is the country of the moon, above all the rest, the fertile and magnificent garden spot of Africa. In its center is the district of Unyanambe, a delicious region, where some families of Omani who are of very pure Arabic origin live in luxurious idleness. They have for a long period held the commerce between the interior of Africa and Arabia. They trade in gums, ivory, fine muslin and slaves. Their caravans traverse these equatorial regions on all sides, and they even make their way to the coast in search of those articles of luxury and enjoyment which the wealthy merchants covet, while the latter, surrounded by their wives and their attendants, lead in this charming country the least disturbed and most horizontal of lives, always stretched at full length, laughing, smoking, or sleeping. Around these excavations are numerous native dwellings, wide, open spaces for the markets, fields of cannabis and datura, superb trees and depths of freshest shade. Such is Keze. There, too, is held the general rendezvous of the caravans, those of the south, with their slaves and their freightage of ivory, and those of the west, which export cotton, glassware, and trinkets to the tribes of the Great Lakes. So in the marketplace there reigns perpetual excitement, a nameless hubbub, made up of the cries of mixed-breed porters and carriers, the beating of drums and the twanging of horns, the neighing of mules, the braying of donkeys, the singing of women, the squalling of children, and the banging of the huge rattan, wielded by the jemadar or leader of the caravans, who beats time to this pastoral symphony. There spread forth, without regard to order, indeed, we may say in charming disorder, are the showy stuffs, the glass beads, the ivory tusks, the rhinoceros teeth, the shark's teeth, the honey, the tobacco, and the cotton of these regions, to be purchased at the strangest of bargains by customers in whose eyes each article has a price only in proportion to the desire it excites to possess it. All at once this agitation, movement and noise stopped as though by magic. The balloon had just come in sight, far aloft in the sky, where it hovered majestically for a few moments, and then descended slowly, without deviating from its perpendicular. Men, women, children, merchants and slaves, Arabs and Negroes, as suddenly disappeared within the Thames and the huts. "My dear doctor," said Kennedy, "if we continue to produce such a sensation as this, we shall find some difficulty in establishing commercial relations with the people hereabouts." "There's one kind of trade that we might carry on, though, easily enough," said Joe, "and that would be to go down there quietly and walk off with the best of the goods, without troubling our heads about the merchants. We'd get rich that way." "Ah," said the doctor, "these natives are a little scared at first, but they won't be long in coming back, either through suspicion or through curiosity." "Do you really think so, doctor?" "Well, we'll see pretty soon. But it wouldn't be prudent to go too near to them, for the balloon is not ironclad, and is, therefore, not proof against either an arrow or a bullet." "Then you expect to hold a parley with these blacks?" "If we can do so safely, why should we not? There must be some Arab merchants here at Keze, who are better informed than the rest, and not so barbarous. I remember that Burton and Speke had nothing but praises to utter concerning the hospitality of these people, so we might at least make the venture." The balloon having, meanwhile, gradually approached the ground, one of the anchors lodged in the top of a tree near the marketplace. By this time the whole population had emerged from their hiding places stealthily, thrusting their heads out first. Several Waganga, recognizable by their badges of conical shellwork, came boldly forward. They were the sorcerers of the place. They bore in their girdles small gourds, coated with tallow, and several other articles of witchcraft, all of them, by the way, most professionally filthy. Little by little the crowd gathered beside them, the women and children grouped around them, the drums renewed their deafening uproar. Hands were violently clapped together, and then raised toward the sky. "That's their style of praying," said the doctor, "and if I'm not mistaken, we're going to be called upon to play a great part." "Well, sir, play it." "You too, my good Joe, perhaps you're to be a god." "Well, master, that won't trouble me much, I like a little flattery." At this moment one of the sorcerers, a Myanga, made a sign, and all the clamour died away into the profoundest silence. He then addressed a few words to the strangers, but in an unknown tongue. Dr. Ferguson, not having understood them, shouted some sentences in Arabic at a venture, and was immediately answered in that language. The speaker below then delivered himself of a very copious harangue, which was also very flowery and very gravely listened to by his audience. From it the doctor was not slow in learning that the balloon was mistaken for nothing less than the moon in person, and that the amiable goddess in question had condescended to approach the town with her 3 sons, an honour that would never be forgot in this land so greatly loved by the god of day. The doctor responded with much dignity that the moon made her provincial tour every 1,000 years, feeling the necessity of showing herself nearer at hand to her worshippers. He, therefore, begged them not to be disturbed by her presence, but to take advantage of it to make known all their wants and longings. The sorcerer, in his turn, replied that the Sultan, the Mwani, who had been sick for many years, implored the aid of heaven, and he invited the son of the moon to visit him. The doctor acquainted his companions with the invitation. "And you are going to call upon this Negro king?" asked Kennedy. "Undoubtedly so. These people appear well disposed. The air is calm, there is not a breath of wind, and we have nothing to fear for the balloon." "But what will you do?" "Be quiet on that score, my dear Dick. With a little medicine I shall work my way through the affair." Then, addressing the crowd, he said, "The moon, taking compassion on the sovereign who is so dear to the children of Unyamwezi, has charged us to restore him to health. Let him prepare to receive us." The clamour, the songs and demonstrations of all kinds increased twofold, and the whole immense ants' nest of black heads was again in motion. "Now, my friends," said Dr. Ferguson, "we must look out for everything beforehand. We may be forced to leave this at any moment unexpectedly and be off with extra speed. Dick had better remain, therefore, in the car, and keep the cylinder warm so as to secure a sufficient ascensional force for the balloon. The anchor is solidly fastened, and there is nothing to fear in that respect. I shall descend, and Joe will go with me, only that he must remain at the foot of the ladder." "What, are you going alone into that blackamoor's den?" "How, doctor, am I not to go with you?" "No, I shall go alone. These good folks imagine that the goddess of the moon has come to see them, and their superstition protects me. So have no fear, and each one remain at the post that I have assigned to him." "Well, since you wish it," sighed Kennedy. "Look closely to the dilation of the gas." "Agreed." By this time, the shouts of the natives had swelled to double volume, as they vehemently implored the aid of the heavenly powers. There, said Joe, "they're rather rough in their orders to their good moon and her divine sons." The doctor, equipped with his travelling medicine chest, descended to the ground, preceded by Joe, who kept a straight countenance and looked as grave and knowing as the circumstances of the case required. He then seated himself at the foot of the ladder in the Arab fashion, with his legs crossed under him, and a portion of the crowd collected around him in a circle, at respectful distances. In the meanwhile the doctor, escorted to the sound of savage instruments and with wild religious dances, slowly proceeded toward the royal tembe, situated a considerable distance outside of the town. It was about 3 o'clock, and the sun was shining brilliantly. In fact, what less could it do upon so grand an occasion? The doctor stepped along with great dignity, the waganga surrounding him and keeping off the crowd. He was soon joined by the natural son of the Sultan, a handsomely built young fellow, who, according to the custom of the country, was the sole heir of the paternal goods, to the exclusion of the old man's legitimate children. He prostrated himself before the son of the moon, but the latter graciously raised him to his feet. 3/4 of an hour later, through shady paths, surrounded by all the luxuriance of tropical vegetation, this enthusiastic procession arrived at the Sultan's palace, a sort of square edifice called a Titania, and situated on the slope of a hill. A kind of veranda formed by the thatched roof adorned the outside, supported upon wooden pillars which had some pretensions to being carved. Long lines of dark red clay decorated the walls in characters that strove to reproduce the forms of men and serpents, the latter better imitated, of course, than the former. The roofing of this abode did not rest directly upon the walls, and the air could, therefore, circulate freely, but windows there were none, and the door hardly deserved the name. Dr. Ferguson was received with all the honours by the guards and favourites of the Sultan. These were men of a fine race, the Wanyamwezi so called, a pure type of the Central African populations, strong, robust, well-made, and in splendid condition. Their hair, divided into a great number of small tresses, fell over their shoulders, and by means of black and blue incisions, they had tattooed their cheeks from the temples to the mouth. Their ears, frightfully distended, held dangling to them discs of wood and plates of gum copal. They were clad in brilliantly painted cloths, and the soldiers were armed with the saw-toothed war-club, the bow and arrows barbed and poisoned with the juice of the euphorbium, the cutlass, the cyma, a long sabre also with saw-like teeth, and some small battle-axes. The doctor advanced into the palace, and there, notwithstanding the Sultan's illness, the din, which was terrific before, redoubled the instant that he arrived. He noticed at the lintels of the door some rabbits' tails and zebras' manes, suspended as talismans. He was received by the whole troop of His Majesty's wives, to the harmonious accords of the upatu, a sort of cymbal made of the bottom of a copper kettle, and to the uproar of the kilindo, a drum 5 feet high, hollowed out from the trunk of a tree, and hammered by the ponderous, horny fists of 2 jet-black virtuosi. Most of the women were rather good-looking, and they laughed and chattered merrily as they smoked their tobacco and thang in huge black pipes. They seemed to be well made, too, under the long robes that they wore gracefully flung about their persons, and carried a sort of kilt, woven from the fibres of calabash fastened around their girdles. 6 of them were not the least merry of the party, although put aside from the rest, and reserved for a cruel fate. On the death of the Sultan, they were to be buried alive with him, so as to occupy and divert his mind during the period of eternal solitude. Dr. Ferguson, taking in the whole scene at a rapid glance, approached the wooden couch on which the Sultan lay reclining. There he saw a man of about 40, completely brutalized by orgies of every description, and in a condition that left little or nothing to be done. The sickness that had afflicted him for so many years was simply perpetual drunkenness. The royal sot had nearly lost all consciousness, and all the ammonia in the world would not have set him on his feet again. His favourites and the women kept on bended knees during this solemn visit. By means of a few drops of powerful cordial, the doctor for a moment reanimated the imbruted carcass that lay before him. The Sultan stirred, and for a dead body that had given no sign whatever of life for several hours previously, this symptom was received with a tremendous repetition of shouts and cries in the doctor's honour. The latter, who had seen enough of it by this time, by a rapid motion put aside his 2 demonstrative admirers and went out of the palace, directing his steps immediately toward the balloon, for it was now 6 o'clock in the evening. Joe, during his absence, had been quietly waiting at the foot of the ladder, where the crowd paid him their most humble respects. Like a genuine son of the moon, he let them keep on. For a divinity, he had the air of a very clever sort of fellow, by no means proud, nay, even pleasingly familiar with the young negresses, who seemed never to tire of looking at him. Besides, he went so far as to chat agreeably with them. "Worship me, ladies, worship me," he said to them. "I'm a clever sort of devil if I am the son of a goddess." They brought him propitiatory gifts, such as are usually deposited in the fetish huts or mzimu. These gifts consisted of stalks of barley and of pombe. Joe considered himself in duty bound to taste the latter species of strong beer, but his palate, although accustomed to gin and whiskey, could not withstand the strength of the new beverage, and he had to make a horrible grimace, which his dusky friends took to be a benevolent smile. Thereupon the young damsels, conjoining their voices in a drawling chant, began to dance around him with the utmost gravity. "Ah, you're dancing, are you?" said he. "Well, I won't be behind you in politeness, and so I'll give you one of my country reels." So at it he went, in one of the wildest jigs that ever was seen, twisting, turning, and jerking himself in all directions, dancing with his hands, dancing with his body, dancing with his knees, dancing with his feet, describing the most fearful contortions and extravagant evolutions, throwing himself into incredible attitudes, grimacing beyond all belief, and in fine giving his savage admirers a strange idea of the style of ballet adopted by the deities in the moon. Then the whole collection of blacks, naturally as imitative as monkeys, at once reproduced all his airs and graces, his leaps and shakes and contortions. They did not lose a single gesticulation, they did not forget an attitude, and the result was such a pandemonium of movement, noise, and excitement as it would be out of the question even feebly to describe. But in the very midst of the fun, Joe saw the doctor approaching. The latter was coming at full speed, surrounded by a yelling and disorderly throng. The chiefs and sorcerers seemed to be highly excited. They were close upon the doctor's heels, crowding and threatening him. Singular reaction. What had happened? Had the Sultan unluckily perished in the hands of his celestial physician? Kennedy, from his post of observation, saw the danger without knowing what had caused it, and the balloon, powerfully urged by the dilation of the gas, strained and tugged at the ropes that held it as though impatient to soar away. The doctor had got as far as the foot of the ladder. A superstitious fear still held the crowd aloof and hindered them from committing any violence on his person. He rapidly scaled the ladder, and Joe followed him with his usual agility. "Not a moment to lose," said the doctor. "Don't attempt to let go the anchor, we'll cut the cord, follow me." "But what's the matter?" asked Joe, clambering into the car. "What's happened?" questioned Kennedy, rifle in hand. "Look," replied the doctor, pointing to the horizon. "Well," ejaculated the Scot. "Well, the moon." And in fact there was the moon rising red and magnificent, a globe of fire in a field of blue. It was she indeed, she and the balloon, both in one sky. Either there were two moons then, or these strangers were impostors, designing scamps false deities. Such were the very natural reflections of the crowd, and hence the reaction in their feelings. Joe could not, for the life of him, keep in a roar of laughter, and the population of Kaze, comprehending that their prey was slipping through their clutches, set up prolonged howlings, aiming the while their bows and muskets at the balloon. But one of the sorcerers made a sign, and all the weapons were lowered. He then began to climb into the tree, intending to seize the rope and bring the machine to the ground. Joe leaned out with a hatchet ready. "Shall I cut away?" said he. "No, wait a moment," replied the doctor. "But this black—" "We may perhaps save our anchor, and I hold a great deal by that. There'll always be time enough to cut loose." The sorcerer, having climbed to the right place, worked so vigorously that he succeeded in detaching the anchor, and the latter, violently jerked at that moment by the start of the balloon, caught the rascal between the limbs and carried him off astride of it through the air. The stupefaction of the crowd was indescribable as they saw one of their waganga thus whirled away into space. "Huzzah!" roared Joe as the balloon, thanks to its ascensional force, shot up higher into the sky with increased rapidity. "He holds on well," said Kennedy. "A little trip will do him good." "Shall we let this darky drop all at once?" inquired Joe. "Oh no," replied the doctor. "We'll let him down easily, and I warrant me that after such an adventure the power of the wizard will be enormously enhanced in the sight of his comrades." "Why, I wouldn't put it past them to make a god of him," said Joe with a laugh. The Victoria by this time had risen to the height of 1,000 feet, and the black hung to the rope with desperate energy. He had become completely silent, and his eyes were fixed, for his terror was blended with amazement. A light west wind was sweeping the balloon right over the town, and far beyond it. Half an hour later, the doctor, seeing the country deserted, moderated the flame of his cylinder, and descended toward the ground. At 20 feet above the turf, the affrighted sorcerer made up his mind in a twinkling. He let himself drop, fell on his feet, and scampered off at a furious pace toward Kaze, while the balloon, suddenly relieved of his weight, again shot up on her course. Chapter 16. Symptoms of a storm, the country of the moon, the future of the African continent, the last machine of all, a view of the country at sunset, flora and fauna, the tempest, the zone of fire, the starry heavens. "See," said Joe, "what comes of playing the sons of the moon without her leave. She came near serving us an ugly trick. But say, master, did you damage your credit as a physician?" "Yes, indeed," chimed in the sportsman. "What kind of a dignitary was this Sultan of Kaze?" "An old half-dead sot," replied the doctor, "whose loss will not be very severely felt. But the moral of all this is that honours are fleeting, and we must not take too great a fancy to them." "So much the worse," rejoined Joe. "I like the thing to be worshipped. Play the god as you like. Why, what would anyone ask more than that? By the way, the moon did come up too, and all red as if she was in a rage. While the three friends went on chatting of this and other things, and Joe examined the luminary of night from an entirely novel point of view, the heavens became covered with heavy clouds to the northward, and the lowering masses assumed a most sinister and threatening look. Quite a smart breeze, found about 300 feet from the earth, drove the balloon toward the northeast, and above it the blue vault was clear, but the atmosphere felt close and dull. The aeronauts found themselves, at about 8 in the evening, in 32 degrees 40 minutes east longitude, and 4 degrees 17 minutes latitude. The atmospheric currents, under the influence of a tempest not far off, were driving them at the rate of from 30 to 35 miles an hour. The undulating and fertile plains of Mfudo were passing swiftly beneath them. The spectacle was one worthy of admiration, and admire it they did. "We are now right in the country of the moon," said Dr. Ferguson, "for it has retained the name that antiquity gave it undoubtedly, because the moon has been worshipped there in all ages. It is really a superb country. It would be hard to find more splendid vegetation. If we found the like of it around London it would not be natural, but it would be very pleasant," put in Joe. "Why is it that such savage countries get all these fine things?" "And who knows," said the doctor, "that this country may not one day become the centre of civilization. The races of the future may repair hither, when Europe shall have become exhausted in the effort to feed her inhabitants." "Do you think so, really?" asked Kennedy. "Undoubtedly, my dear Dick. Just note the progress of events, consider the migrations of races, and you will arrive at the same conclusion assuredly. Asia was the first nurse of the world, was she not? For about 4,000 years she travailed, she grew pregnant, she produced, and then, when stones began to cover the soil where the golden harvests sung by Homer had flourished, her children abandoned her exhausted and barren bosom. You next see them precipitating themselves upon young and vigorous Europe, which has nourished them for the last 2,000 years. But already her fertility is beginning to die out. Her productive powers are diminishing every day. Those new diseases that annually attack the products of the soil, those defective crops, those insufficient resources, are all signs of a vitality that is rapidly wearing out and of an approaching exhaustion. Thus, we already see the millions rushing to the luxuriant bosom of America as a source of help, not inexhaustible indeed, but not yet exhausted. In its turn, that new continent will grow old, its virgin forests will fall before the axe of industry, and its soil will become weak through having too fully produced what had been demanded of it. Where 2 harvests bloomed every year, hardly one will be gathered from a soil completely drained of its strength. Then Africa will be there to offer to new races the treasures that for centuries have been accumulating in her breast. Those climates now so fatal to strangers will be purified by cultivation and by drainage of the soil, and those scattered water supplies will be gathered into one common bed to form an artery of navigation. Then this country over which we are now passing, more fertile, richer, and fuller of vitality than the rest, will become some grand realm where more astonishing discoveries than steam and electricity will be brought to light." "Ah, sir," said Joe, "I'd like to see all that." "You got up too early in the morning, my boy." "Besides," said Kennedy, "that may prove to be a very dull period when industry will swallow up everything for its own profit. By dint of inventing machinery, men will end in being eaten up by it. I have always fancied that the end of the earth will be when some enormous boiler, heated to 3,000 millions of atmospheric pressure, shall explode and blow up our globe." "And I add that the Americans," said Joe, "will not have been the last to work at the machine." "In fact," assented the doctor, "they are great boiler makers. But without allowing ourselves to be carried away by such speculations, let us rest content with enjoying the beauties of this country of the moon, since we have been permitted to see it." The sun, darting his last rays beneath the masses of heaped-up cloud, adorned with a crest of gold the slightest inequalities of the ground below. Gigantic trees, arborescent bushes, mosses on the even surface, all had their share of this luminous effulgence. The soil, slightly undulating, here and there rose into little conical hills. There were no mountains visible on the horizon. Immense brambly palisades, impenetrable hedges of thorny jungle, separated the clearings dotted with numerous villages, and immense euphorbiae surrounded them with natural fortifications, interlacing their trunks with the coral-shaped branches of the shrubbery and undergrowth. Ere long, the Malagazari, the chief tributary of Lake Tanganyika, was seen winding between heavy thickets of verdure, offering an asylum to many watercourses that spring from the torrents formed in the season of freshets, or from ponds hollowed in the clayey soil. To observers looking from a height, it was a chain of waterfalls thrown across the whole western face of the country. Animals with huge humps were feeding in the luxuriant prairies, and were half hidden, sometimes in the tall grass. Spreading forests in bloom redolent of spicy perfumes presented themselves to the gaze like immense bouquets. But in these bouquets, lions, leopards, hyenas, and tigers were then crouching for shelter from the last hot rays of the setting sun. From time to time, an elephant made the tall tops of the undergrowth sway to and fro, and you could hear the crackling of huge branches as his ponderous ivory tusks broke them in his way. "What a sporting country!" exclaimed Dick, unable longer to restrain his enthusiasm. "Why, a single ball fired at random into those forests would bring down game worthy of it. Suppose we try it once." "No, my dear Dick, the night is close at hand, a threatening night with a tempest in the background, and the storms are awful in this country where the heated soil is like one vast electric battery." "You are right, sir," said Joe. "The heat has got to be enough to choke one, and the breeze has died away. One can feel that something's coming." "The atmosphere is saturated with electricity," replied the doctor. "Every living creature is sensible that this state of the air portends a struggle of the elements, and I confess that I never before was so full of the fluid myself." "Well then," suggested Dick, "would it not be advisable to alight?" "On the contrary, Dick, I'd rather go up, only that I am afraid of being carried out of my course by these countercurrents contending in the atmosphere." "Have you any idea, then, of abandoning the route that we have followed since we left the coast?" "If I can manage to do so," replied the doctor, "I will turn more directly northward, by from 7 to 8 degrees. I shall then endeavour to ascend toward the presumed latitudes of the sources of the Nile. Perhaps we may discover some traces of Captain Speke's expedition, or of M. de Huglin's caravan. Unless I am mistaken, we are at 32 degrees 40 minutes east longitude, and I should like to ascend directly north of the equator." "Look there," exclaimed Kennedy suddenly. "See those hippopotami sliding out of the pools, those masses of blood-coloured flesh, and those crocodiles snuffing the air aloud." "They're choking," ejaculated Joe. "Ah, what a fine way to travel this is, and how one can snap his fingers at all that vermin. Doctor, Mr. Kennedy, see those packs of wild animals hurrying along close together. There are fully 200. Those are wolves." "No, Joe, not wolves, but wild dogs, a famous breed that does not hesitate to attack the lion himself. They are the worst customers a traveller could meet, for they would instantly tear him to pieces." "Well, it is Joe that'll undertake to muzzle them," responded that amiable youth. "After all, though, if that's the nature of the beast, we mustn't be too hard on them for it." Silence gradually settled down under the influence of the impending storm. The thickened air actually seemed no longer adapted to the transmission of sound. The atmosphere appeared muffled, and like a room hung with tapestry, lost all its sonorous reverberation. The rover bird so called, the coroneted crane, the red and blue jays, the mockingbird, the flycatcher, disappeared among the foliage of the immense trees, and all nature revealed symptoms of some approaching catastrophe. At 9 o'clock the Victoria hung motionless over Mseen, an extensive group of villages scarcely distinguishable in the gloom. Once in a while, the reflection of a wandering ray of light in the dull water disclosed a succession of ditches regularly arranged, and by one last gleam, the eye could make out the calm and sombre forms of palm trees, sycamores, and gigantic euphorbiae. "I am stifling," said the Scot, inhaling with all the power of his lungs as much as possible of the rarefied air. "We are not moving an inch, let us descend." "But the tempest," said the doctor with much uneasiness. "If you are afraid of being carried away by the wind, it seems to me that there is no other course to pursue." "Perhaps the storm won't burst tonight," said Joe. "The clouds are very high." "That is just the thing that makes me hesitate about going beyond them. We should have to rise still higher, lose sight of the earth, and not know all night whether we were moving forward or not, or in what direction we were going." "Make up your mind, dear doctor, for time presses." "It's a pity that the wind has fallen," said Joe again. "It would have carried us clear of the storm." "It is indeed a pity, my friends," rejoined the doctor. "The clouds are dangerous for us. They contain opposing currents which might catch us in their eddies and lightnings that might set on fire. Again, those perils avoided, the force of the tempest might hurl us to the ground, were we to cast our anchor in the treetops. Then what shall we do? Well, we must try to get the balloon into a medium zone of the atmosphere, and there keep her suspended between the perils of the heavens and those of the earth. We have enough water for the cylinder, and our 200 pounds of ballast are untouched. In case of emergency, I can use them." "We will keep watch with you," said the hunter. "No, my friends, put the provisions under shelter and lie down. I will rouse you if it becomes necessary." "But, master, wouldn't you do well to take some rest yourself, as there's no danger close on us just now?" insisted poor Joe. "No, thank you, my good fellow, I prefer to keep awake. We are not moving, and should circumstances not change, we'll find ourselves tomorrow in exactly the same place." "Good night then, sir." "Good night, if you can only find it so." Kennedy and Joe stretched themselves out under their blankets, and the doctor remained alone in the immensity of space. However, the huge dome of clouds visibly descended, and the darkness became profound. The black vault closed in upon the earth as if to crush it in its embrace. All at once a violent, rapid, incisive flash of lightning pierced the gloom, and the rent it made had not closed ere a frightful clap of thunder shook the celestial depths. "Up, up, turn out," shouted Ferguson. The two sleepers, aroused by the terrible concussion, were at the doctor's orders in a moment. "Shall we descend?" said Kennedy. "No, the balloon could not stand it. Let us go up before those clouds dissolve in water, and the wind is let loose." And, so saying, the doctor actively stirred up the flame of the cylinder and turned it on the spirals of the serpentine siphon. The tempests of the tropics develop with a rapidity equalled only by their violence. A second flash of lightning rent the darkness, and was followed by a score of others in quick succession. The sky was crossed and darted, like the zebra's hide, with electric sparks, which danced and flickered beneath the great drops of rain. "We have delayed too long," exclaimed the doctor. "We must now pass through a zone of fire, with our balloon filled as it is with inflammable gas." "But let us descend then, let us descend," urged Kennedy. "The risk of being struck would be just about even, and we should soon be torn to pieces by the branches of the trees." "We are going up, doctor." "Quicker, quicker still." In this part of Africa, during the equatorial storms, it is not rare to count from 30 to 35 flashes of lightning per minute. The sky is literally on fire, and the crashes of thunder are continuous. The wind burst forth with frightful violence in this burning atmosphere. It twisted the blazing clouds. One might have compared it to the breath of some gigantic bellows, fanning all this conflagration. Dr. Ferguson kept his cylinder at full heat, and the balloon dilated and went up, while Kennedy, on his knees, held together the curtains of the awning. The balloon whirled round wildly enough to make their heads turn, and the aeronauts got some very alarming jolts indeed, as their machines swung and swayed in all directions. Huge cavities would form in the silk of the balloon as the wind fiercely bent it in, and the stuff fairly cracked like a pistol as it flew back from the pressure. A sort of hail, preceded by a rumbling noise, hissed through the air and rattled on the covering of the Victoria. The latter, however, continued to ascend, while the lightning described tangents to the convexity of her circumference, but she bore on, right through the midst of the fire. "God protect us," said Dr. Ferguson solemnly. "We are in his hands, he alone can save us, but let us be ready for every event, even for fire. Our fall could not be very rapid." The doctor's voice could scarcely be heard by his companions, but they could see his countenance calm as ever even amid the flashing of the lightnings. He was watching the phenomena of phosphorescence produced by the fires of St. Elmo, that were now skipping to and fro along the network of the balloon. The latter whirled and swung but steadily ascended, and ere the hour was over it had passed the stormy belt. The electric display was going on below it like a vast crown of artificial fireworks suspended from the car. Then they enjoyed one of the grandest spectacles that nature can offer to the gaze of man. Below them the tempest, above them the starry firmament, tranquil, mute, impassible, with the moon projecting her peaceful rays over these angry clouds. Dr. Ferguson consulted the barometer. It announced 12,000 feet of elevation. It was then 11 o'clock at night. "Thank heaven, all danger is past. All we have to do now is to keep ourselves at this height," said the doctor. "It was frightful," remarked Kennedy. "Oh," said Joe, "it gives a little variety to the trip, and I'm not sorry to have seen a storm from a trifling distance up in the air. It's a fine sight." Chapter 17. The mountains of the moon, an ocean of verdure, they cast anchor, the towing elephant, a running fire, death of the monster, the field oven, a meal on the grass, a night on the ground. About 4 in the morning, Monday, the sun reappeared in the horizon, the clouds had dispersed, and a cheery breeze refreshed the morning dawn.